Many on the right are looking for a moral and religious framework that is not Christianity, yet struggle to articulate an alternative that is coherent, robust, and serious. Which way, Western man? Nietzschean vitalism is mostly vibes and aesthetics, which is not bad and can be personally galvanizing, but it lacks binding obligation and shared cultic order. It is also, like civic nationalism, a portable identity. Anyone from anywhere can be a vitalist. The traditionalism/perennialism of Guénon and Evola is more serious, but tends to retreat from the immanent into transcendental initiatic elitism, leaving behind ordinary folk. Moreover, it is likewise a propositional and therefore portable identity. Perennialism posits a universal metaphysical truth transcending all particular traditions, so it cannot function as a constitutive principle of a particular folk. Platonism is intellectually impressive with its highly sophisticated, ready-to-hand metaphysics and even a kind of esoteric theology, but it is thoroughly axial. It substitutes inherited cult and local gods with universal forms and the One, turning tradition into an object of critique and leading ultimately to disenchantment and universalism. White identitarianism, or ethno-nationalism, is a natural, healthy recovery of in-group instincts, but by itself is still somewhat abstract and political, not yet a whole worldview. Folkishness, the subject of this video, is the alternative worldview I advocate. It is more than a philosophy, ideology, or brand of aesthetics. It is a holistic, time-tested way of life. This video is deeply indebted to Mike Maxwell, founder of Imperium Press, who has developed these ideas at length over at the Imperium Press Substack. Mike is one of the sharpest and most important voices on the right today. I highly recommend subscribing to the Imperium Press Substack and checking out their books, especially Mike's own Cultured Thug Handbook, which serves as a compact yet comprehensive introduction to the structure and spirit of the folkish worldview. Let's begin with a working definition. To paraphrase Maxwell, folkishness is an earthward disposition toward pre-political identity, the layers of belonging that precede ideology: family, clan, tribe, folk, race. You could also say that folkishness is simply the Aryan worldview, the archaic, pre-axial orientation of our Indo-European forefathers. Folkish identity is layered and nested, family within clan, clan within tribe, tribe within folk, yet the higher layers depend on the lower for their integrity. The folk can't be strong without strong tribes, without strong clans, without strong families. Maxwell uses a taxonomy analogy to make this point. There is no genus Canis without particular canids, wolves, dogs, coyotes, etc., instantiating it. The higher categories depend on the lower ones. Folkishness is of vital importance today because liberalism hasn't just changed our laws and the demographics of our countries, it has dissolved the social fabric and hollowed out the families, clans, and tribes that make up our folk. The foundations of the folkish worldview are as follows. Foundation 1. Thrownness. Thrownness, a term from the philosopher Martin Heidegger, refers to the fact that you are thrown into the world, descended from particular ancestors at a particular time and place, given your mother tongue, moral intuitions, customs, genetics, etc. Thrownness, your heritage, is fundamentally what makes you you, and it is entirely unchosen. The liberal rejects heritage, replacing organic identity with propositional identity. For the liberal, you are what you believe. Thus, Vivek Ramaswamy is just as American as George Washington because he believes in American values. Folkishness sees propositional identity for what it is: weak. An identity you can be argued into, you can likewise be argued out of. It binds only so long as the individual feels like being bound. Moreover, if you ask a liberal like Vivek what American values are, they'll just list the tenets of liberalism: religious tolerance, individualism, race-blind meritocracy, which turn out to be indistinguishable from the purported values of Australia, Canada, Britain, and basically any liberal state outside America. This is why civic nationalism, the political manifestation of propositional identity, is really just inconsistent globalism. Liberalism, if it is to be true to itself, is forced to say that founding stock Americans, being replaced by Said, Jose, and Arjun, are merely being replaced by themselves. Folkishness avoids such lunacy by beginning with the given, not the chosen, embracing heritage, with all its binding ties to blood and soil, not as unfortunate accidents to be shrugged off, but as the very bedrock of who we are. Choice exists, but downstream of and radically bounded by what has already been handed down. The alternative to autonomy is not slavery, as the liberal would have you think, but heritage. And here one must choose. Freedom or heritage. You can't have both because the liberal notion of freedom means emancipation from the given, while heritage is precisely the given. It's interesting to note, though, as Emil Benavist shows in his Dictionary of Indo-European Society, that the original meaning of freedom was not unboundedness at all. Maxwell summarizes, quote, "If we examine the linguistic root of liber, we discover that it does not answer to anything like the liberty of the Declaration of Independence. Liber is the name of a god of vegetation. Children are called liberi. Cognates in Old Slavic and Modern German give us the people. Other cognates in Gothic and Sanskrit give us grow. What unites these between children, vegetation, the people, and growth? We have here the idea of a common stock or breed, a metaphor for the organic growth of a people. To be free in the original conception is not to be rid of something, but to belong to something. In fact, it is to be unable to be rid of something. We have the concept of a common stock based on shared ancestry, something immutable, permanent, and inherited, the complete opposite of what freedom later came to mean, even in classical times." End quote. Real authenticity just is thrownness. Folkishness therefore rejects the liberal fantasy of self-authorship. You are your instincts, your attitudes, your roles, your assumptions, your traditions. As Maxwell puts it, you either have heritage or you are nothing. Foundation 2, Heteronomy. What follows from thrownness is inherited obligations, giving us the folkish moral form, heteronomy. Heteronomy is a Greek term meaning law from another. In folkish society, obligations flow from without, from kin, from the community, and ultimately from tradition, the commands of the ancestors. Folkishness recognizes that morality, by definition, must come from without. For, as Maxwell says, if one can bind oneself, one can just as easily unbind oneself. If morality depends on the will of the moral agent, then morality prescribes nothing. Without heteronomy, duty vanishes into thin air. The axial rebellion against authority resulted in the discarding of heteronomy and the turn to autonomy, law interpreted by the individual. But once you're in a position to interpret or judge the law, you effectively are the law, making individual conscience the final court of appeal, collapsing duty into preference. This was the result of accepting Plato's solution to the famous Euthyphro dilemma, which asks whether a thing is good because God commands it, or if God commands it because it is good. If you choose the latter, you make authority beholden to the good, which means you've replaced the sovereign with a super-sovereign abstraction, which must then be interpreted. The Platonist and later Christian attempt to solve the dilemma by making God and the good one and the same turns out to produce the same result. If God is identical with the good, then God is redundant, and so can cleanly be dispensed with, again leaving an abstraction in his place. Since abstractions lack personhood and will, someone must decide what the good requires in this or that situation, and so the individual becomes his own judge and God collapses into the self. The point is that morality, if it is to bind at all, must come from outside the moral agent. The liberal project rests on the belief that man can be both sovereign and subject, legislator and obedient servant, father and child to himself. But a man cannot command himself any more than he can hold himself hostage. Folkishness therefore rejects self-legislation and affirms heteronomy, not as one moral form among others, but as the only form morality can take if it is to prescribe anything at all. Foundation 3, Imperative Ethics. If heteronomy tells us why morality binds, imperative ethics tells us what kind of thing morality is. The basic stuff of morality is not the proposition, but the command. If morality is the forest, commands are the trees. Strictly speaking, there are no ethical propositions, only meta-ethical propositions. Propositions about commands and the authorities from which they issue. Unlike the proposition, which is judged in terms of its truth value, the command is not true or false, but apt or inapt, proper or improper, depending on who issues it and to whom. A command from father to son may be apt, The same command from son to father may be absurd. Folkishness is therefore pre-propositional and so pre-ideological, trafficking in imperatives and practices, which apply not to abstract man as such, but to particular persons standing in particular relations. Modern people typically mistake moral language for propositional language. They treat "you should respect your elders" as though it were the same kind of statement as "Warsaw is the capital of Poland," differing only in subject matter. But the word "should" is just an abstracted command, and every command presupposes an authority. What makes "you should do X" binding is not some free-floating moral fact, but the implicit warrant "authority Y commands X." The proposition "you should obey your father" is really a derivative and indirect way of saying "obey your father," or pointing to an authority who commands it. Liberals treat not only identity but morality as propositional, thus tending toward moral universalism. Propositions deal in truth, and truth is universal. If a proposition is true, it is true regardless of who speaks it and to whom it is spoken. Folkish morality, by contrast, is imperative-based, and so agent-relative and irreducibly particular. The husband's imperatives and the wife's, the ruler's and the subject's, the father's and the child's, cannot be reduced to one neutral rule without erasing the very relations that generate one's imperatives, leaving behind only empty universals like "be good" or "do your duty," which tell you nothing about what your duty actually is. This does not make ethics subjective, where each man decides for himself what the law is. Imperative ethics says commands are objectively apt or inapt, though not universally so, because they are fitting for particular agents in particular relations rather than for abstract man as such. As Hume famously observed, no is can generate an ought. No accumulation of descriptions will ever by itself yield an obligation. This is no problem for imperative ethics because moral propositions are downstream of commands. Moral language becomes intelligible once we see that authority and command are primary, while propositions and reflection are derivative. Foundation 4. Factualism. Factualism is the idea that something is always already in place before reasoning begins, a brute fact, axiom, or primordial assumption that cannot itself be derived from reason because it is what makes reasoning possible in the first place. Framing factualism as irrationalism cedes the frame to the rationalist, as though his were the default good sense position. But factualism does not reject reason, it subordinates reason to what reason itself presupposes. When you look out and see blue, a tree, marriage, or justice, you are already relying on distinctions that your tradition has taught you, or really commanded you, to recognize as blue, tree, marriage, and justice. This is not to say that tradition creates reality, but that it furnishes the names, concepts, and standards by which reality becomes intelligible. Metaphysics, our picture of reality's basic structure, is thus downstream of tradition. The metaphysical grammar of Platonism construes reality in terms of stable being and form, whereas Heraclitean or classical Chinese philosophy sees reality in terms of relation, process, and change. As Kant demonstrated, pure reason can produce compelling arguments both that the world has a beginning in time and that it has no beginning. It's not that one tradition sees reality truly and the other doesn't, but that different traditions hand down different articulations of the real, different conceptual grammars through which the world becomes intelligible. We do not first arrive at abstract truths and then build a tradition. Rather, propositions depend on concepts, and concepts are received through tradition. Foundation 5. The ancestral principle. If authority is epistemically prior to reason, then the next question is, what gives authority its binding form? It cannot be an abstract principle because abstractions are themselves handed down by tradition. Maxwell tells us, authority is authorship, meaning that obligation arises from origin. A command binds because it issues from that which made, constituted, founded, or transmitted the form of life within which one stands. What makes X authoritative over Y is that X stands to Y as a father to child, as source to derivative, as begetter to begotten. To ask why obey tradition is really no different from asking why obey your father, the answer to which is not given in a syllogism but a relation, because he is your father. The ancestral principle resolves a number of conundrums on the right. If two commands conflict, priority goes to the one that is more ancestral and more properly one's own. This is what gives the principle its practical force. It is not merely a pious sentiment about respecting one's ancestors, it is a rule for adjudication. The alternative is to make oneself the judge of authority, which is to destroy authority by relocating it in the self. One of the most practical and important applications of the ancestral principle concerns the religious question. Which religion is authoritative? Not the one the individual finds most convincing after private reflection, but the one that is more ancestral and more properly his own. For the man of European descent, Islam or Judaism can never be authoritative because they are foreign. Christianity is trickier because it has been with us for centuries. But here too the ancestral principle gives an answer. The deeper, older, native, and so, for us, pagan layer remains more authoritative than the later import. The ancestral principle thus places Christianity under a serious and perhaps fatal tension with folkishness. There are Christians who are white identitarians or ethno-nationalists, but folkishness is more than racialism. Folkishness means subordination to ancestral imperatives, and Christianity's claim to validity requires, at some point, a break with ancestral imperatives. At most, I could perhaps say this much. One can hold Christian beliefs and be folkish, but Christianity has, at most, a derivative authority, and is acceptable only insofar as it does not war against the ancestral religious life of the people, does not malign the old gods, and can accommodate itself to public deference to paganism when appropriate. Whether such a synthesis is ultimately stable is another question. The ancestral principle also clarifies how we should think about the break in European pagan practice. A common objection to reviving European paganism is that because the European pagan tradition was interrupted, it therefore no longer binds. According to this view, continuity is treated as a necessary condition of legitimacy. The response to this is to reject the premise altogether, because it confuses obedience with authority. Tradition is not mere custom, but inherited command, not simply the memory of ancestral practice, but the transmission of ancestral imperatives. The relevant question, then, is not whether a command has been continuously followed, but whether it binds. A command does not cease to be a command because it was ignored, interrupted, or forgotten. Its authority cannot depend on uninterrupted obedience, because that would make obedience the source of authority. In other words, the continuity criterion gets the relation exactly backward. It implies that tradition is authoritative because it has been continuously transmitted and recognized, such that legitimacy flows upward from practitioners rather than downward from a commanding source. But this reduces authority to self-legislation, and thereby destroys it. If a break in continuity invalidated ancestral obligation, then any command could be dissolved simply by being disobeyed, and any inheritance nullified by neglect. Law itself would become impossible, because it would depend on the very will it is meant to bind. Before the first act of obedience, no command would yet be valid, and so none could ever begin to bind at all. Moreover, appealing to the continuity criterion makes uninterrupted observance the test of legitimacy, which gives whatever currently prevails an automatic advantage simply by virtue of having prevailed. But then, the continuity criterion is just progressivism, protecting the present against judgment by anything more ancient than itself. Interruption is irrelevant to legitimacy. Pagan revival is just renewed obedience to authority whose commands were never annulled. Foundation 6. Differential ontology. The political intuition behind differential ontology is captured by David Goodhart's distinction between somewheres and anywheres. The somewhere is rooted in a place, a people, and a way of life, and experiences identity as inherited and given. The anywhere is unrooted, treating identity as portable, chosen, and detachable from place and folk. Folkishness is, in this sense, the metaphysics of the somewhere. It sees distinct peoples, places, and forms of life not as accidents laid atop a deeper sameness, but real things in and of themselves. Folkishness, and nationalism generally, is not a love of sameness, but a love of difference. Folkishness therefore rejects monist ontologies that reduce reality to a single substance, essence, or unitary first principle. In every kind of monism, what is most real is what is most universal. The one is prior, the many are secondary, and particularity becomes a kind of limitation, defect, or derivative appearance laid atop a deeper, realer sameness. Platonists will insist that this does not erase real distinctions because participation in a higher unity can still yield genuine kinds, ranks, and boundaries. Folkishness answers that this is insufficient at best. If unity is made ontologically prior, unity soon becomes psychologically prior and then morally prior. Sameness comes to be treated as deeper than distinction, and difference as contingent, accidental, and in need of justification. Differential ontology reverses that priority. Difference is not not a secondary relation between already formed things, but a precondition of their being things at all. A thing can only be a thing insofar as it differs from some other thing. Etymologically, we see that existence comes from the Latin meaning to stand out, while being is rooted in becoming, growing, appearing. Difference, boundary, exclusion, and contrast are not accidental features laid atop a deeper unity, they are the very ground of form. To be is to be other than. Folkishness does not just reject monism, but goes on the offensive. A pure one can have no properties, as all properties are necessarily grounded in it. But then the one is not the richest principle, but the emptiest, indistinguishable from nothing. To say anything at all about anything, we must distinguish it from something else, if only between subject and predicate. But the one of monism cannot admit distinction on pain of being what it is not. It therefore collapses into something totally ineffable and unintelligible. This is why monisms like Platonism do not culminate in religiosity, but tend first toward pantheism and then toward atheism. If the one, aka God, can by necessity admit no distinction, then God, existence, and the world are indistinguishable, at which point the concept of God is redundant. Either one introduces an arbitrary and illicit exception to distinguish God from the world, destroying monism, or one admits their identity, yielding pantheism. This move does not have a track record of enchanting the world. If God and the world are in no way different, then one or the other eventually drops out. Which is more likely? Is the existence of God or the world more in doubt? A look at history gives us our answer. Differential ontology gives us a very different picture of the real. The world is not a single transcendent unity trickling down into lesser derivatives, but a field of irreducible kinds, tensions, oppositions, and bounded forms. Unity is real, but not primordial. It is an achievement. A thing is one only insofar as it holds together amid difference, contradiction, and motion. Heraclitus used the image of a vinaigrette. It has unity only while it is being shaken, only while unlike elements are held in dynamic relation. So too with any real thing, a man, a family, a tribe, a folk. Each is not a denial of difference, but an ordering of differences into a stable pattern, internally articulated and externally bounded. Monism versus differential ontology has political implications as well. Nations, sexes, ranks, and roles do not exist despite difference, but through them. You only have male because it is not female, citizen because he is not foreigner, inside because it is not outside, America because it is not Mexico. Crucially, hierarchy, too, depends upon difference. Without difference, there is no rank order, and so no intelligible order of any kind, whether cognitive, aesthetic, or political. Monism is not just a metaphysical error, but the ultimate egalitarianism. Once reality is flattened into a deeper sameness, all boundaries become suspect, and the path is opened for universalism, globalism, and rule by abstraction. Folkishness avoids this problem, saluting the world as it is given. Men and women, child and elder, noble and peasant, Norwegian and Nigerian. These are not epiphenomena floating atop a deeper sameness, they are the joints along which reality and obligation are carved. We may add that the primacy of difference is native to our tradition. Archaic Indo-European religion and society were saturated with duality, polarity, and separation. Family from family, God from God, city from city, one man's property from another's. What this suggests is that the aboriginal metaphysic of the Indo-Europeans was not monism but difference, with monism later appearing as a degeneration. Foundation 7. Particularism. Particularism is the view that what matters most is not what makes us the same, but what makes us different. A few universal moral imperatives may exist, but are relatively thin, weak, and unimportant. Particularism points to a bounded moral horizon of care, which extends outward in concentric circles, rather than uniformly across universal humanity. One does not owe the same level of care or loyalty to father as to cousin, as to stranger, as to mankind as a whole. As the Bedouin proverb puts it, I against my brother and I against my cousin and I against the world. The result is not chaos, but the opposite. Loyalty is now ranked. The nearer has priority over the further. Particularism is therefore not blind favoritism, but a graded structure of obligation. Particularism resolves the problem of conflicting loyalties. Identity is multi-layered. A man may be son, cousin, artisan, Englishman, white man, and more all at once. The question is not whether multiple loyalties can exist, but how they are ranked when they collide. Particularism says we prioritize those who are closer to us, unless the nearer party has betrayed the deeper ancestral order from which his own authority derives. Liberalism dissolves this order of obligation by treating humanity as morally prior to groups. But if everyone is in my tribe, there is no tribe. A loyalty that extends equally to all is by definition not loyalty, it is just virtue signaling. Not only does folkishness prioritize what's closer, it simply doesn't concern itself with what lies beyond its horizon of care. Folkishness is not identitarianism in the universalist sense of advocating a homeland for all. Folkishness is not opposed to other folks having homelands, but it is unconcerned with such abstractions. Other peoples factor into its horizon of care only insofar as they affect one's own. Particularism means taking our own side, right or wrong. It means blood over principle. We do not fight to spread our values, we fight to secure the existence of our own. Foundation 8. Asabiyyah. If particularism defines the horizon of care, Ibn Khaldun's concept of Asabiyyah, which we can translate as group feeling, solidarity, or clannishness, names the cohesive force within that horizon that both enables and motivates the folk to compete with other groups. Asabiyyah is both social glue and source of vitality. Importantly, according to Khaldun himself, Asabiyyah results only from blood or a proxy for blood. It does not arise from voluntary agreement or shared beliefs alone. Creed can sometimes serve as a proxy for blood when it roughly maps onto blood, but once religion or ideology becomes too universal, it dissolves rather than reinforces Asabiyyah. That is why Islam could function as a proxy for blood among Arab tribesmen for a time, yet increasingly universal ummah conflicts with and collapses its tribal solidarity. One could say the same for Christianity during medieval Christendom compared to modernity, where it has become a universalizing religion, fastest growing in the Third World. Asabiyyah is what makes a people warlike and communitarian. Certainly, some people have died for ideas, but far more often, they have died for their kin. Every great civilization stands atop the foundation laid by tribal barbarism. The high culture so far removed from such barbarism draws from a deeper reservoir of blood-bound solidarity that, if not replenished, leads to the eventual demise of that civilization. Thus, Asabiyyah explains the cyclical rise and fall of civilization. It tends to be strongest among rural populations who are not as insulated from nature's feedback, and whose conditions demand greater cooperation, sacrifice, and toughness. As societies expand, urbanize, and soften, the original group feeling attenuates. At that point, something more abstract, usually religion or ideology, is brought in to hold things together. But this surrogate identity is weaker than the organic one it replaced, and over time, vitality ebbs away and the civilization becomes ripe for conquest by another folk with more Asabiyyah. Foundation 9. Corporatism. Corporatism is the most, really the only, stable social ontology because it starts from the fact that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Society is a body, Latin corpus, and unable to survive dismemberment. The individual is not a building block out of which society is assembled, but a limb grown inside a living order, posterior, derivative, and defined fundamentally by his role. Corporatism is directly opposed to both liberal individualism and Marxist classism. Both of these share the same part-first social ontology. The individual, or the class, is treated as primary, and the group as a whole is at best a contractually bound aggregate, liberalism, or an instrument to some further end, communism. Corporatism reverses this. The whole comes before the part, and the parts cooperate as organs. Families, guilds, estates, professions, each with a function, a duty, and a stake in the integrity of the body. This is not quite collectivism in the eusocial or Eastern sense, because corporatism is heterarchical, or pluralist rather than monist. It does not absorb all differences into one all-encompassing whole, but recognizes many bounded wholes, each with its own inner hierarchy, integrity, and sphere of rule. At first glance, corporatism, whole before part, seems to contradict differential ontology, difference before unity. The contradiction dissolves once we specify scope. Within a bounded whole, the whole precedes the part, Corporatism, but the bounded whole exists at all only as against other wholes, Differential ontology. Sparta is Sparta because it is not Athens. This is why corporatism is distinct from monism. Treating corporate bodies as monist would collapse their boundedness, which is essential to their identity. Monism posits one true whole, humanity, the cosmos, or being as such, whereas corporatism posits many wholes, each sovereign in its own sphere. Finally, we may note that the folk, or nation, is the natural upper limit of the social body. Beyond it, there may exist cross-national military or trading alliances, but not much in the way of organic unity or cohesive force. Foundation 10. Absolutism. Within any given political order, the buck always stops somewhere. Maxwell uses a thermodynamic metaphor to make this point. Sovereignty is conserved. If a sovereign can be restrained, then whatever restrains him is the real sovereign. Liberalism cannot abolish sovereignty any more than it can abolish hierarchy, it merely conceals it. And concealed power, precisely because it is hidden from scrutiny and denied in principle, tends to act badly. Absolutism does not mean rule without custom, counsel, or duty. It means that the head in a given sphere must actually have final authority in that sphere, that he truly be king of his castle. A ruler who may always be overruled by rival centers, procedural abstractions, or hidden interpreters is not really ruling at all. Absolutism is therefore not the opposite of localism, but its precondition. At each level, someone must be clearly in charge, free to govern his local context, without paralysis by endless appeal and procedural sclerosis. Only where authority is settled can lower orders breathe, because only then are they not constantly subject to overrule from above, sabotage from the side, or sedition from below. If you want government to be smaller in reach, you should want it to be stronger in form at every level. The earliest form of law among the Indo-Europeans was the absolute command of the house father, the dems potus, addressed to wife, children, and dependents. The household was a little kingdom, a little church, and a little court all at once. The house father was high priest, supreme magistrate, sole proprietor, and commander-in-chief. The clan chieftain, the tribal leader, and the king were extensions of the same absolutist structure of authority, widened outward. Absolutism is not foreign to our tradition, but at its very root. The modern current of absolutist thought, from Baudin to Filmer to Maistre to Schmidt, was the revival, under modern conditions, of a much older Indo-European social structure. This is what liberals fear when they protest and chant "no kings." The West began not with popular sovereignty, but with the patriarchal household and the warrior king. What liberalism presents as a monstrous exception is, historically speaking for us, the norm. Foundation 11. Immanentism. Because Folkishness embraces Thrownness, what is given and near, it treats the sacred as in the world, not behind or beyond it. It refuses to outsource the meaning and stakes of life to another realm. This is one of the deepest fault lines between the folkish, archaic, pre-axial, and the axial worldviews. Axiality elevates transcendence and the hereafter. The folkish alternative to axial transcendence is not crude materialism, but worldliness in the older sense, the world as inhabited and morally charged, completely alive with significance. Under the archaic spiritual paradigm, we may call it animism, the divine and the human are radically immanent to one another. The sacred is not sealed off in a remote beyond, but interpenetrates the near and the ordinary. Field, hearth, threshold, river, ancestor mound, boundary stone. These are more than objects of use. They are sites of relation and power. In such a world, religion naturally gravitates toward cult rather than doctrine, orthopraxy over orthodoxy. The point is not to assent to universally true propositions about ultimate reality, but to maintain right relation between folk, land, gods, and ancestors. This is why the ancestor cult is the paradigmatic European folk religion. As Maxwell says, the ancestor cult is the ur-religion of Europeans. The founder ancestor, whether conceived as human, god, or both at once, issues commands that bind the celebrant, and these commands take the form of rites and taboos, what must be done and what must not be done. They are performed formally, often pre-reflectively, because in an immanent world there is no hard separation between symbol and reality, cult and cosmos. The rite does not merely symbolize cosmic order, it participates in and sustains it. This is what scholars of religion call cosmic maintenance. The sacred is not off in heavenly realms, but woven into the continued functioning of the world. Man is therefore neither master of nature nor a passive spectator of it, but an active steward of its preservation. This is why the folkish right, unlike the left, lends itself naturally to what is now called environmentalism. If the land, waters, seasons, and fertility of a place are bound up with sacred and ancestral order, then care for them cannot be a lifestyle preference or an abstract political posture, but a religious duty. Due to its intrinsic environmentalism, folkish religion tends towards cyclical rather than linear time. In the immanent world, sacred order must be renewed again and again through repetition, season after season. Nothing decisive happens once for all and then passes permanently into history. While axial religions tend toward linear history, one-time revelations, final judgment, and a movement toward an ultimate conclusion, folkishness prefers the older rhythm, where ritual and recurrence bind a people into the same sacred order their forefathers inhabited. Foundation 12. Oikophilia. Oikophilia is a term coined by Sir Roger Scruton, meaning the love of the familiar. Home, hearth, kin, custom, all that is ours and from here. It is the emotional precondition of any sane and durable order, because you won't preserve what you don't love. For most of human history, we did not need a special word for this, because it was just called being normal. As Coulanges tells us in The Ancient City, love of home was counted among the virtues by the ancients. Odysseus is the paradigm of this virtue. He is offered treasure, pleasure, and even immortality, and yet what he wants most is to see the smoke rising from his own hearth fire again, to sacrifice on his own soil to his ancestors, resume headship of his household, and rule his own kingdom. The right often characterizes Western man as Faustian, as though our deepest impulse was boundary transgression for its own sake, and an endless striving toward the horizon. But that is, at best, only half the story. The Western soul is not simply hunger for adventure, but thirst to return. Oikophilia is what binds man to what is nearest and most concrete, and so is the psychological complement to immanentism. The man who loves the familiar is not trying to transcend the world, upload his consciousness out of it, or dissolve his obligations to the here and now. What's wrong with the modern West is, in a nutshell, a lack of oikophilia, and the presence of its opposite, oikophobia. As Maxwell notes, in a ghoulish inversion of the old concentric loyalties, the liberal sides against his own, preferring his cousin to his brother, the stranger to his cousin, the animal to the stranger, and the inanimate to the animate. He experiences what is near and familiar not as lovable, but as oppressive, embarrassing, or morally suspect. Oikophobia manifests as a general disposition to denigrate one's own customs, institutions, ancestry, and home, replacing the center with the margin, the familiar with the foreign, until eventually even the human becomes too familiar and must be transcended. Oikophobia is mental illness and oikophilia is sanity, because it is an affection for what actually sustains one's life. A people will only survive if it loves its home enough to defend it, its customs enough to preserve them, and its inheritance enough to pass it on. The folkish foundations we've covered are not isolated doctrines, but different aspects of a single worldview, the archaic pre-axial worldview. Folkishness rejects axiality because it installed a proposition-based, universalist moral and religious grammar that steadily undermined our traditional Indo-European order. The axial age was not, as it is usually portrayed, an ascent out of intellectual, spiritual, and moral primitivism into enlightenment. A sober look at the legacy of the axial age shows that it either introduced or laid the groundwork for transcendence over immanence, the invention of the abstract individual, the interiorization of moral authority and dissolving of heteronomy, the elevation of reason over tradition, the advent of linear time and seed of progressivism, the rise of moral universalism, the basis of civic nationalism, and an antinomian revolt against authority in the name of abstract principle. We do not need any of those things in order to have science, technology, art, philosophy, or any of the other achievements that admirers of classical Greece and the West like to place under the banner of axiality. This is precisely where Karl Jaspers and many others, especially Platonists, need to be resisted. They tend to tie the highest scientific, philosophical, and institutional achievements of the West to the classical Greek elevation of reflective reason above ancestral authority, inherited custom, and cultic order, and to the Western evolution of consciousness. No doubt, Western man did achieve new levels of self-reflective awareness during the classical era, as Ricardo Duchesne argues in Greatness and Ruin, but it does not follow that consciousness could only have developed along axial lines, nor that higher consciousness required the displacement of tradition. The things people usually associate with or attribute to axiality, the ability to coordinate at scale, advanced statecraft, technical development, and industrial capacity, do not, in fact, depend upon axiality. Pre-axial Egypt possessed writing, centralized government, bureaucratic administration, territorial districts, monumental stone architecture, and a durable civilization state. This was by no means primitive. It was high civilization, organized through archaic forms: dynasty, rite, sacred kingship, and cult. Here we have a literate civilization in which writing helped preserve pre-axial forms rather than dissolve them. Shang and early Zhou China supply a second case study and another exception to the sometimes assumed literacy equals axial formula. Writing, metallurgy, statecraft, and civilizational continuity all existed inside a pre-axial ancestral and cultic framework. Rome makes the same point within the West itself. Rome, of course, became one of the most successful empires in history. It built roads and aqueducts on an extraordinary scale, spreading law and maintaining imperial administration over a vast and differentiated world. Yet its social, religious, and moral core was ancestral, patrilineal, and ritually ordered. The paterfamilias held absolute authority in the home, like the Indo-European dems potus before him. Roman education was formed around the mos maiorum, literally the way of the ancestors, or custom of the elders, and Roman religion was centered on cultic practice rather than doctrinal orthodoxy. Rome is a definitive Western example of the fact that the archaic substrate did not have to be overcome before high civilization could exist. In fact, as Maxwell points out, while people often point to Christianity as solving coordination problems, quote, "We had something even better before, the ancestor cult, which built up the Roman Empire, not a bad example of large-scale collaboration. Except whereas Christianity broke down local loyalties, the ancestor cult fostered them, and here we are today." End quote. Much more recently, pre-war Imperial Japan built railways, universal education, a national army, and industrial infrastructure of great power. Yet it also sacralized the emperor and elevated Shinto and the imperial cult within a deeply ritualized and particularist public order. Japan showed that even advanced, modern industrial society does not require axiality. Folkishness and the archaic revival it seeks to bring about is therefore not a regression to primitive barbarism or rejection of civilization, but a recovery of the deeper social and moral grammar from which high civilization is born. It is the orientation that rejects liberal abstractions and transient propositional identities, rerouting us again in the real, in flesh, blood, and soil. Folkishness is growing, I'm happy to say, not, I think, because people are discovering an attractive new philosophy, but because they are rediscovering our older, archaic foundations and realizing that everything else is downstream.